All right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all so much for coming. It's great to see this turnout. My name's Courtney Coyle. I'm the faculty director of Pendleton East, and this is the second of our 3 election-related faculty panels. Before I introduce our panelists, I just wanted to put in a quick plug for the other events that you may or may not be aware of. So we've been hosting debate watching events that I hope some of you may have been coming to. There's one more debate which is actually going to feature foreign policy, so the timing of this is not accidental. This will sort of help get the juices flowing and get you ready for that debate event. But that's going to be on Monday, October 22nd here at 9 o'clock, and we're providing refreshments for those. The final faculty panel will feature the expertise of some of our faculty members from political science and sociology, talking about issues like money, media, and mobilization in the election. So it does look like it's going to be a close one all the way down to the wire, and I'm sure that there will be something, a lot of very interesting things coming out of that discussion, and that's going to be on Halloween, so easy to remember, Wednesday the 31st, also here, also with pizza provided, so hope that you might think about coming to that. And finally, I'm sure everybody knows that the election is going to be on Tuesday, November 6th, and that we're having a big event here in the evening with lots of food, so come, gather, watch the election results. There should be a lot of fun. Okay, so on to today's panelists. I'm delighted to have the expertise of 3 members of the political science department to talk to us about foreign policy. I'm looking forward to learning a lot from them, and I'm sure you are as well. So we have Paul MacDonald. I think I'll provide a bit of an overview for us about U.S. foreign policy. Nadya Hajj, whose expertise is in the Middle East, and Bill Joseph, whose expertise is in China and the Asian region. So with that, I think Paul's going to go first. Thanks so much.
Great, thank you. Thank you for Professor Coyle for inviting the 3 of us. This is a great opportunity. And thank you for showing up. This is a great crowd. I'm always delighted when this many people want to discuss the intricacies of American foreign policy. It fills me with optimism, among other things. So I wanted to open with maybe the good news and bad news about the debate on Monday. The good news is as follows. It guarantees to be an exciting event, guarantees to be contentious. We're going to hear 2 very different viewpoints. I'm sure that the candidates will discuss many of the issues that really matter to American foreign policy, issues like the war in Afghanistan, relations with Pakistan, what's going on in Libya, Syria, the potential rise of China and the effects of that on global stability. So many issues of critical importance to American foreign policy. So that's the good news. We'll have that great, excellent debate. It will be very exciting. The bad news is it will probably make absolutely no difference to the outcome of the election. It will be exciting, but largely irrelevant. And that's sad news. I think that that's a bad reality. But I think it's the case for a couple of reasons. And the general reason is that most Americans just aren't that interested in foreign policy. The conventional wisdom of the role of foreign policy in US elections is that it plays a minimal role. Most Americans are fairly apathetic about foreign affairs. They don't know much about foreign affairs. To the extent that they do follow foreign affairs, they're largely uninformed or have oscillating opinions. And so when most Americans vote, and this makes a fair degree of sense, they tend to vote on their own interests, economic interests, certain values that they might possess. They vote based on their party affiliation. Foreign affairs and the oscillations of US foreign policy don't really enter into that in a significant way. Now, there are exceptions to that. There are times when foreign policy can matter to elections. One exception is if foreign policy is really on voters' minds, if it's incredibly salient. Arguably, 2004 was an example where foreign policy really played a prominent role. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem like this is a foreign policy election, that the voters are that interested in issues of relating to foreign affairs. Just to give 1 or 2 examples of this, in April, Pew conducted a poll where they asked voters to rank issues that they cared about. Foreign policy ranked number 10 on the list. Only 52% of potential voters described foreign policy as very important to their choice. This compared to 86% of potential voters who listed the economy as very important to their decision, and similarly high percentages involving things like taxes or the deficit or healthcare. So foreign policy doesn't seem to be salient as compared to those other issues. Similarly, there was a recent poll in September that looked at independent voters, that elusive slice of Americans who for some reason just can't make up their mind about which candidate they want to vote for. And of those independent voters, only 5% said that foreign policy was their top priority or their top issue that they cared about. Overwhelmingly, 49% said it was the economy. That was the thing that they were focused on. So this really doesn't seem like a foreign policy election or an election where foreign policy will play a substantial role. I think a second reason why it's unlikely to play a substantial role has to do with the nature of the candidates. One situation when foreign policy can play a role is if the two candidates have diametrically opposed views on foreign policy, if there's some series of issues that they really disagree on. And I think that by and large, if you look at the broad philosophies of Governor Romney and President Obama on foreign relations, they're fairly similar. I think both of them largely adhere to what we might describe as a sort of liberal internationalist view of foreign affairs. They both believe that the US should exert leadership, that it should play a prominent role in world politics. They both generally subscribe to the idea that free trade and an open global economy benefits the US and the rest of the world. They generally agree that the US should work with its allies and partners to help advance its interests. They both generally agree that the US should use certain elements of the international institutional architecture to help the US reach and cooperate with others, things like the United Nations, things like the World Trade Organization. And now there are obviously subtle differences on each of those levels, but by and large, from the general foreign policy commitments that these two candidates have, they're fairly similar. I think things would have been a lot different, for example, had the Republicans nominated someone like Ron Paul, someone who has a much different view about the role of the United States in the world. Or alternatively, if we could imagine a world where the Democrats nominated Dennis Kucinich, someone who thinks that there should be a Department of Peace, radically different view of US foreign relations and the role of the US in the world. These two candidates, although they have some important and substantive differences on the big issues, on the big philosophical questions, they're fairly similar. And I think that's why you see a lot of the heat in foreign policy discussions around issues of optics, right? Is the US being tough enough? Right? Is the US standing up for its values? When you're talking about optics, it usually means that the substance isn't there, right? That the substantive disagreements are relatively small or minor in comparison to the big philosophical differences. So that's a reason to be sort of gloomy about this debate on Monday, that it will be fascinating but irrelevant. At the same time, I think this is the irony, which is arguably foreign policy is the one area where the president can make the biggest difference. So the fact that Americans maybe won't be voting on foreign policy or won't be really delving into the details of foreign policy is actually unfortunate, because it is in that area where the president arguably has the most control. Unlike in the domestic sphere in foreign policy, the president doesn't have to worry as much about the interests of Congress, doesn't have to grapple as frequently with the courts and their interpretations of various political policy decisions. The president more or less has a free hand in most issues in foreign affairs. So it really should be an area that the public cares about, because arguably this is a realm where the president can make a big difference. So that's my sort of gloomy and pessimistic take on the debate on Monday. Nevertheless, I think despite those caveats, I think it's important that we pay attention to the debate. I think those subtle differences between Governor Romney and President Obama are significant, and they can have significant consequences. I'm sure that Professor Joseph will talk about some of those in the context of East Asia. Professor Hajj will lay out some of those in the context of the Middle East. I briefly wanted to highlight two that I think are important distinctions between the candidates and that I hope will get some attention during the debate, since I think they are an area where, leaving philosophy aside, there are some substantive differences between the candidates. One issue that I think is a substantive difference and I hope gets some attention has to do with the candidate's stance on defense spending. It'll be really interesting to see how they talk about defense spending and the role of defense spending, both in the US economy and in terms of US power abroad. We're probably all aware that President Obama in 2011 signed the Budget Control Act. This committed him and along with Congress to reduce defense spending by roughly $500 billion over the next 10 years, largely through decreasing war funding, that is funding on conflicts in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. So Obama is committed to a limited reduction in the size of the defense budget, largely based on these spending on overseas conflicts. Governor Romney has a much different position on defense spending. His proposal is to link US defense spending to GDP. That is, he wants to spend 4% of US GDP on defense. This is estimated by nonpartisan groups to cost upwards of $2 trillion over the next 10 years, depending on how fast US GDP grows and how much you ramp up to that 4% level. Just to give you a concrete example of what this might mean, if you extrapolate forward to fiscal year 2020, so roughly 8 or so years from now, President Obama has proposed spending roughly $600 billion on defense. So that would be an increase from the $535 billion that the US is slated to spend on defense in the forthcoming fiscal year. So Obama wants to spend $600 billion in 2020. Romney's plan would commit him to spend $900 billion on defense in 2020. That's a substantive difference. That's a huge difference in the sort of amount of money that could be spent on various weapon systems and in terms of the potential cost in terms of budgetary impacts to deficits and the like. So I think that issue of defense spending is a critical difference. Second area that I think is a difference that I hope gets some attention, but I'm sort of guessing that it might not get as much attention as it deserves, and that's the issue of nuclear weapons. And in particular, the long-term vision of the United States when it comes to nuclear weapons. President Obama, as I'm sure many of you are familiar, right after he got into office, went to Prague and gave a fairly well-received speech where he called for the world to move towards a situation of nuclear disarmament, to lessen the emphasis on nuclear weapons in American foreign policy. He also negotiated a treaty with the Russians known as the New START Agreement that committed the Russians and the United States to limit their nuclear arsenals to roughly 1,500 deployed strategic warheads. So to make pretty deep cuts in the number of deployed strategic weapons that both sides possessed. Governor Romney, in contrast, has stated that he views disarmament as a utopian goal, one that is impossible to achieve. He's come out against the New START treaty with Russia. He's indicated that he sees it as an agreement that doesn't uphold American interests. And he's also said that some of what his defense spending would do is to modernize the US nuclear arsenal. That is, to make it more accurate, able to launch more quickly, and to be more effective across a range of potential scenarios. So I think that that's a substantive difference on the issue of nuclear weapons, and one that has importance if we think forward in terms of what role nuclear weapons will play in US foreign policy over the next 20 or 30 years. In any event, those are some of the issues I look forward to the debate raising and discussing. I think I'll turn it over now to Professor Hajj to talk about some of the US interests and relations with the Middle East. Thanks, Nadya.
Hi, I also wanted to say thank you for having me here today to speak about foreign policy in the Middle East. And so when I was preparing for this talk, I really wanted to create some great graphic or image that would succinctly state how things are going in the Middle East. And this is what I came up with. A sad face. It's very sophisticated. Things are, in fact, very sad and bad in the Middle East. And before I talk about the role of the United States and the situation of the United States in the Middle East, let's not forget that things are extremely bad for the everyday Arab living in Syria and Libya and Lebanon and in refugee camps throughout the region. Things are very bad. But recent Arab Barometer data from respected scholar Mark Tesler reveals that in the last decade, American credibility and legitimacy in the region has waned drastically as well. Our most recent flashpoints in a long history of conflicts are in Libya and Iran, and perhaps you might cite Syria as well. And they are seemingly inspired by anti-American value feelings. Unless you think I'm kind of playing partisan politics to start this off, that I'm being a Bush hater, an Obama apologetic, or a Romney romantic. I'm none of those things. American foreign policy in the region has actually played out very badly for a very long time, I would say since before the 1950s. And I can't really think of a US president that has acted consistently and uniformly in policy in supporting democracy and stability in the region. And to give you a few examples and to try and link them eventually to things going on there today, we denied, but did in fact push for a coup in 1953 in Iran, known as the Mossadegh Affair. In the 1970s, we trained Afghani rebels, and those are the same rebels that are now fighting us using our own training. We also signed, yes, a good thing, a peace accord between the Arabs and Israelis, specifically Egypt, in the 1978 Camp David Accords. However, at the same time, we continued to support the Egyptian leader despite a horrible human rights record and violence against its own people. And so the normal response to this is, okay, that's a lot of criticism, and the sad face isn't very helpful because as Americans, we really are doing our best. We're not perfect, but we're engaging in the region to uphold our American values in a world that threatens to erode them. It's a hard fight pushing for freedom, democracy, stability, and human rights. They're not easy to come by even in the best of conditions. And both Obama and Romney have very similar rhetoric. I agree with Professor MacDonald's assessment that in terms of foreign policy on the Middle East, Presidential candidate Romney actually might say he's a little tougher, but really, if you could look at history as anything to learn from, most US presidents might differ in rhetoric with respect to the region, but actually policy has not played out very differently regardless of partisan preferences. For example, and to just cite a slight difference in platforms, Obama said in September, I think it was absolutely the right thing for us to do to align ourselves with democracy, universal rights, a notion that people have the ability and should be able to participate in their own governance. But I'm pretty certain and continue to be pretty certain that there are going to be bumps in the road. Romney said, this is the time for a president who will shape events in the Middle East and not just be merciful or be at the mercy of the events of the Middle East. I'll get us back on track to have the kind of leadership we need so we can shape the future of this part of the world. Now, he doesn't really specify how he's going to shape that future and how it's really that different than what President Obama has done. And I think herein lies the part that, as American foreign policy experts, we've kind of missed in the whole process of evaluating the Middle East. Yesterday, in the New York Times, Marwan Muashar, a scholar with the Carnegie Endowment for Peace, said in an op-ed, "Times have changed. Many factors brought us to this point. Perhaps most important is the fact that though the Middle East region has changed, U.S. policies have not adapted. If the U.S. wants to stay relevant in the region, during the next 4 years, we need to move beyond our outdated view of ourselves in the region and adapt to a new Middle East where citizens, and this is, I think, very important, are increasingly aware of their own power and especially the gaps between U.S. policies and American values that we profess." And so let me highlight for a moment the gap between what we say we value, democracy, freedom, universal rights, and how we actually perform on the ground. When it comes to democracy promotion, we've actually had a very spotty record in the region. Yes, we supported Egypt in spite of human rights violations of leaders like Mubarak over the decades, but we didn't come to support the Arab Spring until actually it looked like it was going to be quite successful. Things had gotten far enough along that we were pretty sure we were betting on a winner. But we didn't support pro-democracy movements that were happening in Bahrain or Yemen and other Gulf oil-producing countries that were important to maintain relationships because of stability. In addition, when we have made calls explicitly for democracy in the region, it's actually been a code word and interpreted as such on the ground in the Middle East for regime change through direct conflict. We said we wanted democracy in Iraq and in Afghanistan, and what's happened is, yes, we've had a change in leadership, but we have made no guarantee that the will of the people will be reflected in the new regime. And beyond these qualitative examples, let me give you some hard numbers if you need some convincing. That we say we promote democracy, but we rarely put our money where our mouth is. The US allocated only $29 million for the Middle East Peace Initiative, which is an organization that promotes democracy. While the supposed war against Iraq, and I have no idea what this number is now, will be costing about $100 billion. And as a scholar noted, or a lot more than that, as Paul's raising his thumb up. This is, as a scholar, Carruthers, a famous also scholar that studies foreign policy in the Middle East and also works at the Carnegie Institute for Peace. These guys have a stake in peace. He says that this disparity in expenditures is what falls within the framework of subduing the Arab world, making them think we're pushing for democracy, but in fact pushing for our own desire for stability in the region, controlling its capabilities to force it into accepting a new Middle East order that suits the interests of the United States. And the Arab media and the general population there are acutely aware of the rhetoric that we have and then what actually occurs on the ground. Most Arabs, according to the Arab Barometer data set, actually do support American values of freedom and democracy, and many have expressed that they are willing to risk life and limb and to engage in democratic processes to realize that goal. But what they do take issue with, and the data also reveals this, is that they take issue with this gap between our values and the actual policies on the ground. And I think remedying this gap will improve our status and subsequently our policy effect in the region. And I think regardless of the candidate that you vote for, we should seek to close this gap. And I would say that the two primary, or rather I will say the three primary ways that we should close the gap is first, that as the president should embrace the challenge of the Arab-Israeli peace process and commit to making real headway in it. Second, embrace the political transformation occurring in the Middle East. That we need to support the democratic process and not individual leaders. And finally, to recognize that political Islam is not the enemy, that the tractability of extremist message will decline when we cut the poverty and economic vacuum that such groups currently fill in providing public goods in exchange for political allegiance. Thank you, and I look forward to answering questions about specific cases later on.
First of all, those of you who know me know I wear glasses, and it's not that suddenly at the age of 65 I decided to try contacts. But looking for my sunglasses today, I found them, and I took them out of the glasses case and put my other glasses in them, and they're sitting on the dining room table in the case. So I might have to look at my notes like this. If I didn't have my if I didn't have my glasses, I knew if I wasn't going to have my glasses, I might have printed these. Anyway, start with this graphic. I added the Panda Bear punching bag. It's not exactly a Photoshop job. I just posed that picture here, but it shows Romney and Governor Romney and President Obama going at it, and they certainly have been going at it as far as China is concerned. When Courtney invited me to participate on this panel, and it was September 13th, I wrote back the following, quote, "In theory, I'm happy to participate, but China hasn't become an issue in the campaign as it did in 2010, so there isn't much interesting to say." A couple of days later, both campaigns had launched anti-China ads. And on Monday, September 18th, I think it was, the lead story in the New York Times was, quote, "In car country, Obama trumpets China trade case." Let me just play these two ads for you. They're brief, but
This is America's manufacturing when President Obama took office. This is China's. Under Obama, we've lost over 500,000 manufacturing jobs. And for the first time, China is beating us.
and get it to go full screen.
7 times Obama could have stopped China's cheating. 7 times, he refused.
It's time to stand up to the cheaters and make sure we protect jobs for the American people.
Barack Obama failing to stop cheating, failing American workers.
Okay, and now let's go back to President Obama's ad, which came out about the exact time.
It's time to stand up to the cheaters and make sure we protect jobs for the American people.
Mitt Romney, tough on China. Romney's companies were called pioneers in shipping U.S. manufacturing jobs overseas. He invested in firms that specialized in relocating jobs to low-wage countries like China. Even today, part of Romney's fortune is invested in China. Romney's never stood up to China. All he's done is sell more jobs.
I'm Barack Obama, and I approve this message.
There has been something of an anti-China crescendo in both campaigns since then. China came up 3 times in the first debate, including Governor Romney's implication that we had to borrow from China to keep Big Bird on television. This is a quote. I'm sorry, Jim. This is speaking to the moderator, Jim Blair. I'm sorry, Jim. I'm going to stop the subsidy to PBS. I'm going to stop other things. I like PBS. I love Big Bird. Actually, I like you too. But I'm not going to. I'm not going to keep on spending money on things to borrow money from China to pay for. That's number one. Now, put part of that sense together. It's like, it's China that. We have to borrow from China to keep Big Bird on TV. Now, this book, I don't know when any of you read that, but this was among my oldest daughters. She's now 30. It's one of her favorite books when she was small. So maybe send Big Bird back to China. Actually, Sesame Street's pretty popular. It's Chinese version. In Tuesday's debate, China was mentioned 24 times. And next week, since the debate is on foreign policy, it'll be mentioned a lot more because, as I understand it, China is one of the 5 designated topics. So it's going to certainly come up a lot more than 24 times. Now, the 2010 campaign, midterm elections, saw an absolute feeding frenzy of anti-China ads, although they didn't gather as much national attention. Both parties used the anti-China theme in congressional races, Senate races, and gubernatorial races. And this is just a small sampling of some of those ads. Believe me, it was both Democrats and Republicans were going against their opponents for not being tough on China or giving China too many preferences. Now, but as in 2010, so far when China has come up in the campaign, the focus has been almost exclusively on trade issues, particularly the impact on U.S. jobs of China's unfair trade practices, low-cost loans to businesses, cash grants, tax preferences, hidden tariffs, various subsidies, and so on. And the back and forth between the Obama and Romney campaigns has been who's going to be tougher on China. As Governor Romney said in Tuesday's debate, cracking down on China when they cheat is part of his plan for getting the economy going again. In fact, it's actually a subpoint of point 2 of his 5-point plan to get the economy going again in that trade that works for America. But cracking down on China is a key part of that point. Besides calling China a cheater on trade, in that same debate he called it a counterfeiter of American products. He cited counterfeit Apple stores selling counterfeit Apple products. He called China a thief of intellectual property. And then he also called China a computer hacker that threatens our national security. And he's going to crack down on all of these, to which President Obama applied, "Governor, you're the last person who's going to get tough on China," and then repeated some of the themes that you saw in that Obama ad about sending jobs to China and having investments in China. Actually, I want to mention that President Obama said something nice about China. remember what that was. He praised them for their research and development in clean energy, particularly in solar energy. Now, trade is, of course, a very important issue in U.S.-China relations, but it's not the only area of friction or the only area that's problematic. There are, I like to say, there are 5 sources of tension in U.S.-China relations, and they all begin with a T, like alliteration. One, of course, is trade. The second one is Taiwan and America's commitment to democratic Taiwan, and particularly our security relations with Taiwan, and the extent to which particularly U.S. will continue to sell Taiwan the weapons it needs to defend itself. The aircraft particularly needs to defend itself against a potential Chinese attack. That's a headline from an English-language Chinese newspaper. Beijing furious at arms sale. So we've got trade, Taiwan, Tibet. The United States and China certainly don't agree on China's handling of the Tibet situation, and particularly its suppression of religious freedom in Tibet. And then what's the third one? Next one. Oh, that wasn't supposed to be Taiwan. That's supposed to say Tiananmen. Tiananmen. You might. That's a reference to the crackdown of June 4th, 1989, when pro-democracy demonstrators were shot in large numbers, killed in large numbers by the Chinese army. And both the Tibet and the Tiananmen reference here meant to frame the broader issue of human rights, which is, of course, a source of great tension in U.S.-China relations. So we've got 4. We've got trade, Taiwan, Tibet, Tiananmen. Anybody guess what the fifth T could be? No. In order to make it a T, I had to give it my own title. And that's the tilt, or the pivot, or America's rebalancing of its foreign policy, which the Obama administration has done in the last couple of years to pay more attention both to our security, military commitment to the Asian Pacific region, and more economic and diplomatic attention also to that area. And China, this is largely seen in China as an effort to contain China, or to reassure our allies that we are there for them in case they feel threatened by China's military rise, particularly. Anyway, so these are the 5 T's and the sources of tension in U.S.-China's relations. And so far, the focus has been almost entirely on trade tensions. I would imagine in the next debate, it'll get expanded a bit. I think Tibet, but probably not. I think Taiwan will come up because there's some difference about the kind of equipment we should be selling Taiwan. And I think the tilt will probably come up also. But I would imagine that trade will be front and center again and take most of the time that the candidates spend on China. And I expect we'll hear Governor Romney say something similar to his words on Tuesday, and because he's repeated this many times. On day one, what's he going to do on day one? On day one, I will label China a currency manipulator. Whoops, I will label China a currency manipulator, which will allow me as president to be able to put in place, if necessary, tariffs where I believe that they are taking unfair advantage of our manufacturers. He's made this a promise many times, and has said the Obama administration has been soft on China's currency manipulation, which allows it to keep its export prices low. But in fact, President, in the 2008 campaign, in the 3rd debate with Senator McCain, here's what candidate Obama said. We should enforce rules against China manipulating its currency to make our exports more expensive and their exports to us cheaper. In fact, when he became president, he didn't do any such thing. He didn't take any such drastic measures. He rather used diplomacy to encourage China to let their currency rise, and with some success. In fact, he worked hard to promote better relations or good relations with China for at least the first 3 years of his presidency. Then he started talking tougher in the last year or so, partly out of frustration with China's actions over issues like climate change, Iran, and Syria, but also for political reasons. He knew it was good political capital to sound tough on China. But in fact, this represents a fairly consistent pattern where presidential candidates talk tough on China, but if and when they take office, they then adopt a much more balanced approach in managing U.S.-China relations. President Clinton in 1992, candidate Clinton in 1992, really hammered on Bush 1 for being too soft on China as far as human rights was concerned. Now, the Tiananmen killings was fairly recent, but Clinton kept going after President Bush, accusing him of coddling the butchers of Beijing, even hinting that he had spent too much time in China as a diplomat and therefore was too cozy with Deng Xiaoping and other top Chinese leaders. Then when President Clinton got into office, he immediately worked to improve relations with China. In fact, Sino-American relations were pretty solid under the Clinton administration. I agree with Professor MacDonald and Professor Hajj that I don't think there's much difference between the candidates on this issue. And there wouldn't be much of a difference in U.S.-China policy in a Obama or a Romney administration. The bottom line is that, the bottom line, and I'll end with this, is that the U.S. has very little leverage over China on any issue. And U.S.-China relations are just too important, arguably, maybe not even arguably, it's the most important bilateral relationship in the world. U.S.-China relations are just too important and now too interdependent in so many ways to disrupt it seriously. And that's just as true in Beijing as it is in Washington. Now, China scholars are generally, the thing they're most unhappy with is the way that China becomes a political football during every campaign season. And this is alarming because it is destabilizing to relations. It does raise tensions in relations. And also because it tends to have a negative impact on the American public's view of China. This is another Pew poll. This is from fairly recent, on September 2012. General public more concerned about economic issues with China, but is more concerned than government people, retired military, business trade, scholars, and news media. The American people are very alarmed about China, a number of dimensions, particularly trade dimension, and the kind of anti-China or China bashing that you see during every political season, I think plays a role in shaping these negative attitudes.